Hello, and welcome to Shaking and Sipping. This is the show where we shake up a cocktail or other mixed drink, talk a bit about its history, look at some variants, and see how it stacks up. We're continuing our quest to work through the IBA's official list of cocktails to see how those are and whether they're deserving of a place on the list. We're in the second section. These are the contemporary classics, and this week's contemporary classic is the Mint Julep. Now, oh boy, is there a lot to say about the julep and mint juleps and some other related drinks and history and tons to talk about on this week's. I'm sure we won't get to all of it. I'm going to sort of condense and edit as I go, but we'll try to cover quite a bit of the drink and look at a couple different versions. As of recently, I'm trying to, on these long episodes, start off with making a version of the drink first and then moving into the history and things. This time I'm going to do that a little bit differently. We're going to start off with a version of really what a julep is, kind of, if we go back a ways. So I'm just going to mix this up real quick. I've got a glass here. This has water in it and some ice, which is optional. Then I'm going to take some rose water here, and I'm going to pour in a nice healthy glug. I'm going to add about 3/4 of a bar spoon of ultra-fine sugar, and stir. And that is sort of a julep drink, let's say. I'll explain. Yeah, that's fine. It's rosewater scented water. It's not my favorite thing, but it's fine. Okay, now what the heck am I talking about? So, julep. It's weird. This is in the second section, the contemporary classics, because this is in many ways the oldest drink we've covered, other than perhaps when we talked about like ale generally. But this is really old. Even the modern version of the drink is really old. It's way predates cocktails, so I'm not sure why on earth it's in this section. Originally, the word julep comes from a Persian word that I'm sure I will mispronounce. That's something like golab. And this word means something like flower water, or maybe rose water, depending on who you ask exactly. This was a sort of syrup of sort of bits of flowers. Apparently the earliest version was violets, dissolved into water, basically. Over time, some other flowers began being used, some other herbs and things, but that's the idea. And then it was reduced to some extent. Some early commenters mentioned that the difference between it and a syrup is that it's not thickened to the same degree. So I don't really know what that means, but whatever. It's something sort of flavoring. It was taken as a medicinal tonic at various times and places. This does come from sort of Persia area and then throughout the Middle East. Into North Africa, whence it eventually comes to either Andalusia, southern Spain, or southern France. There's a little bit of dispute there, but the word goes into Arabic as something like julep, and then eventually comes into French and Spanish as something closer to julep, whence we get in English julep today. These were almost entirely medicinal things. And when I say these are old, I'm sorry, I didn't mention, the first book these are recorded in dates from 900. Not 900 years ago, 900. And it is first talked about in the Western world back in the 15th century in a translation of that book from 900. It's then written up in a whole bunch of French, Spanish, other sort of European countries under various guises as sort of these medicinal tonics, right? These have sometimes mint in them, so there's our mint connection, but various botanicals, many of them not nearly as pleasant as mint. And these are cures for various things, health tonics. A lot of them have various resins, camphor, that sort of thing in them. And they don't sound very good to me, but these float around in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, all over the place, eventually making their way over to the States as well. At some point, and we're not entirely clear on when, because there's a little bit of conflicting information here. At some point, alcohol became a more common component of a julep. It seems like from a couple hundred years previous, it had been started to be added, but more as a method to help dissolve certain oils, botanicals, etc., things that are only alcohol soluble. At some point, there began to be a split between juleps that were more for the consumption of alcohol and juleps that were these medicinal, tonic-y things. And so we know by the 1770s, at the latest, there was a connotation of juleps as an alcoholic beverage. We know this because there is a character in a play who's a drunkard, and his name is Mr. Julep. And we also begin to see other satirical references, lots of satirical references to juleps, about people who can't start their day without a julep and all this different stuff in the 1770s, 80s, 90s. By the 1800s, like the first decade, it's definitely a popular drink and it's definitely alcoholic. Now, this earliest version that we see is described as a spirit, usually rum, but a few others, brandy, the other big one as well, rum or brandy, sugar, and water. Now this is a sling. We've talked about slings. We didn't do an episode on them, but they are, of course, the prototype to a cocktail. An old-fashioned, an original cocktail is just a bittered sling. So this initial version is just a sling. This is the oldest cocktail there is. And some early versions mentioned throwing a sprig of mint into it. Again, whether this was just a garnish onto that or from the earlier julep tradition of sometimes having mint and other herbs in it, we don't know exactly. They really didn't write down much detail about this. But the earliest julep is just a bittered sling. Not a bittered sling, a minted sling. And so then over time, other things began changing about it. Brandy, cognac was the most common way to make it. There were some versions with peach brandy, by which I think they're describing like a peach eau de vie. And then sometimes a mixture of those. And then by the mid-19th century, bourbon begins becoming common. Still does not overtake it for sure. There are newspaper articles and things complaining about people recommending whiskey for a julep in the 1880s, 1890s, and saying, obviously, this should be cognac. What are you doing? So it wasn't an instant changeover, but that's the time period where that definitely was changing over. It's a drink that's in Jerry Thomas's book. We talk about Jerry Thomas's book a lot, of course. When it's just called a mint julep, he does mean the brandy version, but he specifically mentions both a whiskey version and a gin version, by which he would be meaning Ginevra or Genever. And so that's where the drink comes from. It's also really closely related to a smash, which is also in Jerry Thomas's book, and it's basically a smaller julep that's usually prepared a little bit differently. It's usually agitated a bit more, we shall say, and sometimes the ice choice is different, but a very similar drink, and sort of a whole family of drinks that sort of sprouts out in the mid-19th century, and then by the turn of the century have been absorbed back into julepdom. So now we call sort of drinks in that family juleps often, even if they are variants. So that's the basic history. What you'll notice really isn't part of the history are things like the julep glass, the classic sort of silver glass that can frost up with ice on the side. That was certainly used early on in the julep. Well, not early on, not 900, but certainly used in the 19th century for a julep and things, but that's very context specific. So in certain regions, juleps were more of a fancy thing. In certain regions, they weren't. That's more of just a thing where people were showing off in different places. There's lots of dispute about ice early on, how finely it should be crushed, how much should be in there, do you mix it in the glass? These are still disputes to this day. There's not one right way to make a julep. It's not a complicated drink. It's a sling with some mint in it. So why it's in this sort of mid-century section of the IBA list, I don't know, but it certainly does belong on the IBA's list. So, this is not quite as good as the other ones, I'm going to say, even though we haven't made them yet. We're going to make 3 versions today, none of which are going to be exactly the IBA spec, but we're going to get very close. You'll see why, hopefully. We'll start off with the one that is very much closest to the IBA spec, Then we'll do an old favorite from the middle of the 19th century, and then finally we'll do a smash. Let's get to it. Alright, so first a note on glassware. I mentioned earlier that you don't really have to use a julep cup. That said, this really is not the ideal vessel either. I don't have a julep cup. What I would like for this is sort of a wider, slightly squatter, highball glass, Collins glass, that sort of shape. But I really don't have anything that's exactly right. So we're going to use this, and, I apologize. So how we're going to start this is basically the way the IBA makes it today. We're going to up the proportion of our spirit, but we're going to basically follow what they say to do, and basically the same as what Jerry Thomas's recipe would have been. So we're going to start off with some sugar. This is to taste. I'm going to use sort of just scant of a bar spoon. And then I want about 2 bar spoons of just water. I'm going to try to stir that to integrate. Could you use simple here? Absolutely you could, and certainly in the 19th century gum syrup was a fairly common sub here. The only reason I'm doing it in this way is that I like it slightly more watery for muddling the mint in. And mint integration is something very complicated to discuss in the juleps. There's basically 3 methods. There is the muddle, the shake, and the infuse. So the muddle is the most traditional. That's what the IBA calls for. That's what Jerry Thomas calls for. And for this, you take some amount of mint. Amounts are all over the place. But I'm going to take 3 nice sprigs of mint. I like to leave the stems on. This is very controversial as well. Though I'm going to chop off just the very dead ends here. And then we're going to add these directly in here. And we're going to muddle them. And we're not trying to rip them up. A lot of folks will tell you that when you destroy mint, when you really start ripping it to shreds, you release a lot of bitter compounds. This is true. You also release more of the mint though, too, which is why we'll do one of the other methods a little bit later. So, we've softly muddled to hopefully release some of the mint essence into our sort of sugar water component there. We're then going to add our spirit. IBA calls for 60 milliliters here, which is exactly what we're going to use in our smash later. So we're going to be a little more accurate to 19th century practice and go to 90 milliliters or 3 ounces. Now, we're going to do bourbon because that's the most common today and that's the IBA spec. There's a lot of dispute about what bourbon to use here. A lot of folks strongly believe in a wheated bourbon, so like a Maker's Mark or a Weller's. A lot of people strongly believe in pulling out sort of the best of the non-wheated bourbons, something with 10 years plus of age on it, hopefully a barrel strength. So that I don't have to try to solve that argument or make a case there, just to mildly piss everybody off, I'm going to go ahead and use my 4 Roses. This is my sort of go-to down-the-middle bourbon. I quite like it, but this is an unwheated bourbon. It's a blend of 10 different bourbons, all aged at least 5 years, so it's not incredibly young, but it's not a 9, 10, 12-year product. It's not wheated, but it is good. So now that we have that, I'm going to give it just a stir now. Part of the reason I'm doing that is because if we were building this sort of the way that you expect that we are building this, it's going to get harder to stir once we add our ice, because everyone knows that juleps are served with crushed ice, right? Not the IBA. They say juleps are served with cracked ice. So, okay, we'll get some cracked ice. Now, despite the fact that I said we're using cracked ice in this first version, I have insufficiently prepared. I forgot to freeze an extra tray of big cubes last night. So I only have 2, which is not enough to fill this glass and to have one to use for my smash later. So I'm going to use a Lewis bag and mallet as though I'm going to crush ice, but I'm instead going to stop early at cracked ice. Hopefully. It's not something I normally try to do, so we'll give that a shot. All right, so hopefully we've got some nice cracked ice here. Yeah, that's maybe a hair finer than cracked, but that's fine. And again, there's slight disputes here. Do you add the cracked ice and then the bourbon, or do you do the bourbon and then the cracked ice, and so on and so forth? It really doesn't matter terribly. When you're using crushed ice, order of operations is slightly more important just because you're really trying to pack the glass full, and so when and how you can stir it becomes a bit of a challenge. In this case, it doesn't matter. The very earliest versions, before you add the ice, have you pluck the mint from out of it once you're done muddling and stirring, and then try to reuse that same mint as the garnish. That's great for reasons of mint economy, but if you have mint around, just go ahead and do that if you want, and then go ahead and just put that mint right in the top there. The last thing is juleps typically are going to be served with a straw, and so we could do that. In this case, since it's the cracked ice, I don't really know that that's a necessary element. Also, just as a historical little note, we often have this strainer out when we're using the mixing glass as opposed to the tins. And this is often called a julep strainer. And the reason being is these initially were a little bit smaller, had this shorter sort of curved handle on it. And you actually used these individually on your own glass in order to drink out of it without getting ice and mint and whatever else was in your drink. You actually used this in your glass. So that's good. I mean, it's something that's really only going to appeal to you if you really like both mint and bourbon, especially at the sweetness level that I went to there. I think most modern versions you see, especially like at the Kentucky Derby or something, going to have quite a bit higher proportion of sweetness. That really tastes sling adjacent, right? That is bourbon, really not much sugar, and then just a little bit of mint, sort of back of palate, kind of open. But Four Roses has a nice, slightly rye spice character right in the middle of the palate, but is also still a little bit soft, a little bit of, not quite vanilla, but vanilla adjacent barrel notes. I'm getting all of that with some mint high and up in the back. I really like this. If you are either not a person who likes Four Roses sort of just neat or on the rocks, and or someone who doesn't love mint, you will hate this because that's what this tastes of. I like it. All right, for variant number 2, we're going to look at the prescription julep. This was a mid-19th century concoction. It's called the prescription julep because it was originally written up in Harper's in this sort of comical, I mentioned the connection of juleps to comedy for some reason, right up as though it was a doctor's prescription. So it's initially written like in all Latin and with, compounding instructions essentially. So we're going to go ahead and make that. It's a little bit of a different idea. It's still going to be a julep, still mint, but now we're using a very different grouping of spirits. So we're going to start off very similarly with some sugar and water. I want a little more sugar this time. I'm going to go with a just sort of full bar spoon, and maybe just a skosh more. So it's like 1 and 1.25 maybe. And then we're going to add to that, I'll actually measure this, about 15 milliliters of water. Yeah. Gonna go ahead and stir that gently to at least partially combine. All right, then for this guy, we're gonna go ahead and pull some leaves. Depending on size of leaves, you're looking for anywhere between about 6 and 10 leaves, just depending on how big they are and how you like it. We're again going to follow the same muddling procedure. We're muddling just enough to involve the mint, get a little bit of extraction. We're poking a few little holes in it sort of, but we're not trying to rip it to shreds. We're not trying to do anything crazy. We're just pushing down with a little bit of force, give it a slight turn, no rippage. Basically know it worked when you just smell a ton of mint in the room. All right, now we're going to need lots of additional ice, and this time we will try to take it a little bit further and get more to something like a crushed ice. All right, that still feels actually ever so slightly not pounded enough, but I feel that any more hammering may result in a revolt of my neighbors. So that's perhaps a hair too large of pieces of ice, but that's not miles away. And so we're gonna fill it pretty much to the top there. And then we're gonna go in with Cognac. This is a good place. I know when Paul Clark wrote this up, he used a really interesting sort of barrel strength Cognac. This was years ago, I don't remember what it was. But I've heard a lot of folks say that that's a good idea. I don't have any Cognacs in the 110 proof range. So I'm using Pure Front 1840, like we usually do. And then we're mixing with that rye. I'm using Rittenhouse's Bonded, of course, my favorite. I don't know if it's my favorite, but it's my go-to, certainly. Of this, I want about 15 milliliters. I don't know if I even said on the Cognac, but on the Cognac, you're looking for anywhere from 45 to 60 milliliters, depending on your taste. We're going to go ahead and give that another stir. This is where if you were using the sort of metal julep glass, you would get really nice visible condensation on the outside. We're going to top that up. Maybe. All right, so we've topped that up with additional ice. We're then going to take a couple of nice healthy sprigs of brandy and add those. We're also, is very common in early juleps, prescription juleps, even smashes, to garnish with berries in season. I've got a couple of blackberries here. We'll do 3 of those in there. That looks kind of nice. And then I need a straw. Now, for this, you want to make sure your nose is getting right down onto that mint. So I actually take the straw here and I'm going to cut off the last couple inches of it. That way, I'm going to get that right next to the mint. Now this is done. This would be a great place to stop. You probably should stop here, but if you're feeling a little bit wild, and you should have done this before the garnishes, but I just wanted to do a fake out there, which I'm sure was exciting. You do a little float of some rum. So we're just going to put just a little bit of Smith & Cross, another one of my absolute favorites, really funky, fun Jamaican pot stilled rum. And this is a prescription julep. So I've got the Smith & Cross on the nose. I've got the mint on the nose. I even have a hint of berry on the nose. Then I've got this drink that's overall a hair sweeter, but still largely alcohol, but a little bit of increased dilution from all that ice and how small it is. I've got still a little bit of the rye character like I had in the bourbon, but now the rest of the mouth is that rich, dark cognac. So it's like we've taken all the best places of cognac, added just a hint of that rye spice, a little bit of sweetness, a little bit of mint, beautiful nose. That's really good. I like this a lot. Highly recommend the prescription julep. All right, for our final drink, we're going to look at the Smash, which, like I sort of intimated earlier, isn't really a clear drink that's anything. It's some sort of smaller variant of a julep that then has its own variants for a little bit and then just becomes a julep again. So it doesn't really exist today. Occasionally you'll hear about a brandy smash or other smashes. And we could even argue that next week's drink is a smash of sorts. But this is a shaken or stirred drink. And the reason we're going to make it is both to make one that's slightly smaller and also because it's a place to try out method 2 of mint integration, which is shaking it right in there. Now this is going to rip up the mint quite a bit, and that's a problem because that's going to release a lot of bitter flavors that we don't necessarily want. It's also, though, going to release even more of the menthol and mint flavors that we do want. So it's a trade-off, and there are differing opinions on this. We're going to try it and see how it works for us. I like a decent amount of mint, so I'm going to use one full stalk, and then this other sort of tiny stalk. This is again a little bit smaller, so we're gonna go with a little more sugar than the first julep, but a little less than the second one. I've got just one, not even quite full bar spoon of ultra fine. We're gonna add just a splash of water. Now we're gonna shake this, so we don't really need to muddle or stir this. I'm gonna give it just the tiniest stir, just to get a little bit of that sugar dissolving before I add ice to it. Great, I can see that started to dissolve a little bit. We're gonna add our spirit. Here we're gonna go back to the Four Roses, and we're gonna cut back to 60 milliliters, 2 fluid ounces. I'm gonna get some ice and we'll shake it up. All right, for this one, I'm just gonna crack 1 cube into my double fashion glass. That ice has some kinds of weird cleavage planes in it. Then for this one, I like to actually throw in the berries first. I've seen this in some old guides. I just think it looks cool pouring it over the berries, so do what you like. I'm going to go ahead and strain that out. This is going to catch most of the bits of mint. You can double strain if you want to be absolutely sure. And of course, we're going to garnish that with some more mint. And that is a Whisky Smash. A lot of mint on the nose, obviously. Hair of the berry sweetness. Did not make a huge difference in preparation, to be completely honest with you. I feel like there is a hair of bitterness at the front, which sort of integrates in with the bourbon in a negative way. Like when you first taste that hot alcohol feeling right on the tip of your tongue, there's a slight additional bitterness or astringency there. But as it rolls further back, that upper big mint thing that I reported on drink 1 feels bigger here. I don't have strong feelings either way about that. I sure like it. I love mint though, and I love bourbon. All right, thanks so much for coming along with us this week as we looked at a few different variants of mint julep. If it's something you've never tried and you're a fan of mint, as well as either bourbon or cognac, definitely give it a try. Feel free to experiment though, try other spirits, try other mixtures, it's worth a try. Is it my absolute favorite drink? No, I think there are much better drinks we've come up with since. Definitely deserves to be on the list, though it should have been in the last category, but it is worth a try and a worthy drink. Check the blog, we'll have a write-up on this and each other drink, shakingandsipping.com. That's also where you can go the day after this video posts to see a write-up of IBA in real life, where we go to a local Seattle cocktail bar, order it, see if they make it often, if they have variants, etc. Not sure yet if we'll do that for this one, but the way you will know is either checking that blog or following on Twitter at shaking_sipping. I'll be back next week with the next drink from the IBA's list. Until then, happy sipping. Cheers.